Imagine telling investigators that you were nowhere near the place where your wife and son were murdered. Imagine repeating that story for months. And then investigators find a tiny piece of evidence on a dead man's phone. A piece of evidence that places you at the crime scene just minutes before the killings. That was the moment Alex Murdaugh's story began to collapse. Because this wasn't just a witness saying they saw him. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was a recording. And the person who unknowingly recorded it was one of the people who would never get the chance to explain what happened that night. His son, Paul. This is part 2 of the Alex Murdaugh story, the night everything changed. On June 7, 2021, Alex Murdaugh called 911. His wife Maggie and their 22-year-old son Paul had been shot to death near the dog kennels on the family's property Moselle in South Carolina. Paul had been shot with a shotgun. Maggie had been shot with a rifle, and almost immediately, investigators were faced with a terrifying question. Who would want this family dead? But there was another question that would become even more important. Where was Alex Murdaugh when it happened? Alex initially told investigators that he had been away from the kennels. He said he had spent time with his family earlier, but eventually left. According to his account, he later returned and discovered the bodies. At first, that story was difficult to disprove. There was no camera showing the murders, no obvious eyewitness, and the killer had apparently disappeared into the darkness. But investigators weren't finished, because Paul had a phone, and Paul had been using it that night, the phone that kept talking. Months after the murders, investigators discovered something extraordinary. There was a video on Paul's phone. It had been recorded at the dog kennels at approximately 8:44 p.m. At first, it looked completely ordinary. Paul was filming around the kennels. There were dogs, there were voices. Nothing about the recording seemed like the kind of evidence that could crack open a double murder investigation. Until investigators listened carefully. They heard Maggie. And they heard another voice. Alex. A person who had previously told investigators he wasn't at the kennels around that crucial time. The video didn't show anyone being murdered. It didn't show a gunman. But it did something incredibly important. It placed Alex at the kennels shortly before the killings. People who knew the Murdaugh family identified Alex's voice on the recording. And suddenly, the timeline investigators had been building looked very different. The alibi problem. Think about what that meant. For months, Alex's story had been that he wasn't at the kennels shortly before Maggie and Paul were killed. But now, there was a recording from Paul's phone, and Alex's voice was allegedly on it. The evidence didn't answer every question, but it created a massive problem. If Alex was at the kennels shortly before the murders, why had he denied being there? And perhaps more importantly, what happened during the few minutes between that recording and the killings? That tiny window of time became one of the most important parts of the entire case. The prosecution would eventually argue that Maggie and Paul were killed shortly after the kennel video was recorded, and that meant Alex had been with them shortly before they died. But there was still no video of the murders, no murder weapon recovered from the scene that conclusively tied Alex to the killings. So investigators had to build their case piece by piece, and the next piece was Alex himself, the man who kept lying. As the investigation continued, Alex's financial problems began coming into focus. This was no longer simply a murder investigation. Investigators were uncovering allegations of massive financial crimes involving clients, settlements, and money that prosecutors said Alex had stolen. Eventually, he faced dozens of charges related to financial crimes. The picture emerging was complicated. Alex had once belonged to one of South Carolina's most powerful legal families. For generations, the Murdaugh name had carried enormous influence in the region. But underneath that reputation, prosecutors alleged, Alex's financial world was collapsing. And that raised a disturbing question. Was the murder of Maggie and Paul connected to the financial chaos? The prosecution would eventually argue that Alex was under enormous financial pressure. And the closer investigators looked, the more complicated the story became. Then came September 4th. Just 3 months after Maggie and Paul were murdered, something happened that sounded almost unbelievable. Alex was shot. He told authorities that someone had attacked him while he was on the side of the road. At first, it appeared that Alex himself might have been the next victim. But investigators soon discovered that the story wasn't what it seemed. Authorities said Alex had arranged for another man to shoot him in an attempt to make his surviving son, Buster, eligible for a $10 million life insurance payment. The plan failed. Alex survived. And instead of becoming another unsolved mystery surrounding the Murdaugh family, the shooting became another case against Alex. He was eventually arrested on charges connected to the insurance scheme. And now investigators weren't just asking whether Alex knew something about the murders. They were discovering evidence that he had allegedly been willing to orchestrate an entirely separate scheme involving his own death. The money trail. Then came the financial charges. Prosecutors accused Alex of stealing millions of dollars from clients and others. By January 2022, he was facing 71 charges involving allegations that he had stolen nearly $8.5 million from more than a dozen people. The story was becoming almost impossible to separate into individual pieces. There were the murders, there were the financial crimes, there was the staged roadside shooting. There were allegations involving drugs and money laundering, and at the center of all of it was Alex Murdaugh. But prosecutors still had to prove the biggest accusation of all, that Alex had murdered his wife and son. In January 2023, Alex Murdaugh went on trial for the murders of Maggie and Paul. The courtroom quickly became one of the most watched criminal trials in America. And then came one of the most dramatic moments. Alex took the witness stand. He denied killing Maggie and Paul, but he admitted something that mattered enormously to the prosecution. He admitted that he had lied to investigators about being at the kennels. For the prosecution, that admission was devastating, because the kennel video had already challenged Alex's original story. Now Alex himself was admitting that his earlier account wasn't true. But Alex's defense argued that lying did not make him a murderer. A person can lie, a person can have financial problems, a person can be addicted to drugs, and still not be guilty of killing two members of their family. So the jury had to decide something much bigger. Was Alex Murdaugh a desperate man surrounded by secrets, or was he the person responsible for the deaths of Maggie and Paul? Less than 3 hours. After approximately 6 weeks of testimony, the jury began deliberating. And then something happened that shocked many people. The jury reached its verdict in less than 3 hours. Guilty. Guilty of murdering Maggie. Guilty of murdering Paul. On March 3, 2023, Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to life in prison. For many people watching the case, that seemed like the end. But it wasn't. Not even close. Alex continued fighting his conviction. His lawyers argued that problems surrounding the original trial had affected the jury. Eventually, the case reached the South Carolina Supreme Court, and in May 2026, something happened that completely changed the story. The state's highest court overturned Alex Murdaugh's murder convictions and life sentence. The court found that the former Colleton County Clerk of Court had improperly influenced the jury and had egregiously attacked Murdaugh's credibility. That does not mean the court declared Alex innocent. It means the murder convictions were overturned and the case was sent back for a new trial. And now, Alex Murdaugh is going back to court. A new judge has set jury selection for April 5, 2027. The prosecution will once again have to prove that Alex murdered Maggie and Paul. The defense will once again have the opportunity to challenge the evidence. And the famous kennel video will once again be part of the story. But this time, the courtroom will be different. The jury will be different. And the prosecution has to try the case again, which leaves us with one chilling question. After everything that has happened, can prosecutors convince another jury that Alex Murdaugh was responsible for the deaths of his wife and son? Or will the weaknesses in the original trial give his defense enough room to create reasonable doubt? Because one thing is certain, the story that seemed finished in 2023 isn't finished at all. 2 people were killed at a family property in the darkness of a South Carolina night. A son's phone unknowingly captured voices that would become crucial evidence. A powerful family's reputation collapsed. Millions of dollars disappeared. A staged shooting exposed another layer of the story. And a man once sentenced to life in prison is now preparing to face the murder charges again. But perhaps the most haunting part is this. The kennel video didn't capture the murders. It captured something much smaller. A few voices, a few seconds, a normal moment between family members. And yet those ordinary seconds would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in one of America's most complicated murder cases. The next trial may finally bring another verdict. But until then, the question remains. What really happened at Moselle on the night Maggie and Paul Murdaugh died? And was Alex Murdaugh telling the truth? Or was the truth hiding in the few minutes captured on his son's phone?